In 1939, America was a military afterthought, a nation with an army described as, quote, a few nice boys with BB guns. Just years later, we became the arsenal of democracy, transforming our entire industrial base in months, not decades. Today, we face a critical question. Can we recapture that lightning-fast innovation? How do we rebuild a supply chain that can respond to global threats with the same urgency and creativity that turned Detroit's auto plants into weapon factories overnight? We're diving deep into the DNA of American industrial mobilization, exploring how we can reawaken the spirit of William Knudsen and reimagine our defense supply chain for a new era of global competition.
Great news! I've upgraded Pebble's voice module.
Internal Business Intelligence, the all-in-one dashboard solution for companies
you do?
with 50 to 500 employees.
I've accidentally installed movie preview software instead of the voice update.
Witness Cold Start Tech turn chaos into clarity. Experience the power of data-driven decisions.
Fix it now.
Visit coldstarttech.com/error
At least you
for
got the
04,
website right.
voice not found.
My name is Jason Canigan. I'm the founder of Cold Star Technologies, and I wanted to find out what is really going on in space and defense. So I started interviewing experts in the field, and over the past number of years have met with over 150 academics, engineers, business owners, venture capitalists, military, and government officials. I call this effort the Cold Star Project, and it's where you'll ride along with me to find out what is really going on in space and defense. So thank you, Bill, for meeting with me again. You're one of the top 3 people who I wanted to talk to again, starting this thing up. You're one of the people who I feel very comfortable with about having a geopolitical discussion, an engineering discussion, a history discussion, right? I feel like there's enough of that Venn diagram crossover there. We could hit any topic.
Yep.
And so...
And it'd be great if we could separate them and only talk about science and engineering and not have to worry about history. But the reality is they are intertwined, right? I can't separate my brain and be like, I'm only going to think about it through this lens. You have to think about it holistically.
Right. And that's a great point, because I went to you and said, well, what do you want to talk about? And you came back with, well, there's this book, Freedom's Forge, which is about the armaments industry for America in World War II and why it was so successful. And I'm an operations management guy. I went to school for operations management, right? That's my area. And I should have heard of these people. It's just like Albert Kahn. Why did I not hear about this person? And then I have to get to be over 40. Yeah. Now I'm almost 50, right? Before I hear about these people. So I look, and the book's been out for 10 years, and it's getting a resurgence now. I was able to watch a long lecture by the author from about 10 years ago when it first came out. And I think he's added to it a bit or revised it a little bit. But it's a fun book to read. It's entertaining. It's written, it's not dry at all. And it just takes you through this whole process, which is a contradictory methodology, not only to what you would think happens, but also what maybe should have happened, and also what the Germans were doing, which was what maybe we sort of ought to have been doing in that sense. But because we took this approach, or Franklin Roosevelt took this approach, we got a hell of a lot more productivity out of our armaments industry and building back up and starting from nothing. I have a few notes here from the book. And so it's getting to be around 1940. The U.S. is not in the war yet, but Franklin Roosevelt, who's been a president for a while, is thinking, I didn't want to get into a European war, but it's looking like it's going to happen. I better do something. There were 6 working arsenals in the entire country at the time. And this, Patton is playing with his tanks. He can't get the nuts and bolts to hold them together. He asks the quartermaster of the army to get him some. Nothing ever happens. I mean, this is the level, right, of nothing happening. Finally, he orders them himself from the Sears catalog. Right? Just to get a bit. But August 1939, right before the war starts in Europe, the U.S. Army gets itself 50,000 men together. Doesn't go well. Troops of men are wandering around looking for officers to tell them what to do. There's no radios to communicate with, although They existed. We just didn't have them. And Time magazine goes, looks like we got a few nice boys with BB guns out there, right? And we're supposed to be going to war. And so Roosevelt goes, uh-oh, what are we going to do here? And instead of doing what you would think he would have done, which was he's sort of socialist leaning, right? Centralized government, big programs, top down. We give you, and I'm sure the armed forces would have loved this too. We give you the specs, the designs. We want you to get it to these standards. Our guys are going to be on the end of the production line signing off on that particular unit, which was what was happening in Germany. He did something different. So he went to Bernard Baruch, who had been leading the World War I armament spike, I guess, in managing that, and said, hey, do you want to do it again? You know, you did a really great job last time. And Bernard was like, Franklin, I got raked over the coals by congressional committees and accused of all kinds of horrible things. I'm not doing that again. But you know who you should talk to? Three guys, Bill Knudsen, and Bill Knudsen, right? And so Bill Knudsen was this Danish immigrant who had come over in 1900, worked for Ford, and then started working for GM, and had worked up from the bottom, you know, sweeping floors and riveting, and then designed his own steel alloy, and got to this point where he's suddenly working for General Motors and ends up being, you know, in charge of the whole thing. Somehow he got a reputation for really getting things done, and this reached Washington. And so Roosevelt called him and said, hey, can you help me? And what can we do? And so instead of having that top down, forcing people to do what you want and making things match to your specifications approach, what the Armed Forces of America ended up doing was going, okay, here's what we want. It needs to hit these bullet points. You design it. You tell us. And one of the freakiest things that I learned, I had no idea. All the World War II bombers were designed all before World War II. Like that just blew my mind, because I know there's a transformation here, and the B-29 in particular is a modern looking bomber, right? It looks a lot like a B-52. It looks like something we could see today. And to think like, no, that was designed in 1939. What? Right. And then they could build more systems into it. And so the advantage of doing it this way was that the manufacturers were bought in. They were bought in emotionally. They weren't forced, you know, to use a design that was rammed down their throats. It was their design. They knew their production capabilities, their factory designs, the stuff that's all interesting to me as an ops guy, right? And so they could go, we know how to do this. We know how to organize production to maximize the output here, right? And so this very, very different approach. And that's how America was able to mass produce tanks, planes, aircraft carriers, Liberty ships, right? There's another fellow mentioned here too, named Henry Kaiser, who came out of New York, went west, ended up running a construction cartel that built the Hoover Dam, and then
just a small little project,
just a little project, you know, that went on for years, and you know, ended up being a shipbuilder and building all these Liberty ships. So, some just completely different methodologies, and there's a Drakenfell is a guy who runs that's the name of his channel. He's a British guy who does naval histories and does a lot of looks into what American naval thinking was during the interwar period. And it was not like this. It was very slow, very ponderous, not funded well. There was just a terrible torpedo that was a constant problem until wartime. And so to come out with this, right, engaging the energy of these manufacturers by giving them the specs of what you want and then getting them out of the way was a real eye opener. So let's start with that. What was your takeaway when you first read the book?
So a little bit of a yes and no. And so a couple of things that become interesting, right? And so perhaps the clickbait of it is a open-ended question. What is the highest level direct commission of an officer that has ever occurred in the U.S. military? Right? Like, you know, Eisenhower was a 5-star general. Have we ever directly commissioned a 5-star? No. You know, for the programs that we're running today, where we realize that we need more cyber expertise and, you know, a handful of other like this is the key expertise that we need. Let's go directly commission someone, who has a decade plus of experience and bring them in uniform. And like, we're going to make them a captain in the Army. Is the highest we've ever done a captain? No. What is the highest that we have ever directly commissioned someone from civilian life into uniform? It's a 3-star general, which is Bill Knudsen. And so it is fascinating, how few people know the story of how, and so at the time it was like the Army Aviation Materiel Command, right? Today we would recognize it as kind of Air Force Materiel Command, because obviously the Air Force was the U.S. Army Air Corps. And so technically he was commissioned into the Army. What was he really responsible for? Ensuring that this thing, the Air Corps actually had the aircraft required to go and do their mission. And so there's a secondary part, though, that I think is maybe the other side of the exact same coin. If not for Knudsen and Kaiser, would we have the industrial base today that we have? And my answer there, I think, is no, we would not. And so I can argue like the great man theory of history, where it's like, to understand World War II, if you know what Roosevelt did and you know what Stalin did and you know what Hitler did, you understand, no, right? Like there was a lot more that was required to actually make the war happen. And so it's a little bit sophomoric to point to only Knudsen and Kaiser and basically say that is the reason we have the industrial base that we do today. But what's interesting about Knudsen, and I agree with probably 90-something% of what you said, kind of as you went through and hit kind of a high level summary of like, what is Freedom's Forge really all about? But what's interesting about Knudsen is, as a civilian, outside of government, he could look at what was brewing on the horizon and across the pond, and no different than Roosevelt and everyone else in America, go, this is kind of where everything is pointing. And so there's part one there, but fundamentally, what was his company in the business of when he was working for General Motors? They were in the business of making cars, right? And so you can't just be like, I see a national security threat. There's no requirement, there's no money from the government, but shareholders and employees, I think the right thing to do is, right? Like you can't make that statement running a for-profit publicly traded company and just pivot your business model when the time isn't right, for lack of a better way of putting it. So what did Roosevelt say? Roosevelt basically said, come work for me inside of government. We will make you, a civilian. You're working for me. You will be responsible for. And so he, ethically in kind of the parlance of today, we would say that he had left industry and he had come over, in some sort of, special hiring authority to do something that was critical. And so there's a variety of kind of, highly qualified expert, yada, yada sort of things that Congress has authorized today. It would have felt kind of like that, right? And so this is this HQE, he's running the hallways, he's only here for 4 years. And then you have this entire amount of momentum that has been building for everyone that has been, and this in many ways predates the Pentagon, but today, right? The momentum of the Pentagon, the momentum of DOD, this is what, the different military departments want to kind of see happen. And then you come in and you go, yeah, but you're only here for 4 years, and you're really here because the president said that he thought that you were the guy, but you don't understand. What we need to do is my thing that we've been talking about for the last 5 years. Knudsen as a civilian was actually not successful, which is the reason that they had to directly commission him as a 3-star. And by putting him in uniform and giving him, kind of that framework to work in, then meant that culturally, organizationally, it was now understood that he was representing the Army as a 3-star to make sure that everything that had to happen was going to occur. The other thing that he was able to do was looking at everyone that he had been calling up in his supply chain for, decades in his time, in the different roles across General Motors. He had the ability to pick up the phone and call and say, let me articulate to you why this is the right business case for you, right? And so it was not purely his ability to say, well, look at what's happening in Europe and look at the fact we're going to need this as a nation. What I need you to do is, reasonably, right? And obviously I wasn't born yet. I wasn't there for the conversations, but reasonably he sat down and he said, let's talk about the ROI, right? Let's talk about the return. Let's talk about what this is going to do for your company. let's talk about the fact, I mean, you know that we've been making cars out of steel like that, right? I mean, that goes back to Henry Ford and like how it all began. But there's this other material called aluminum. Maybe we should play with that a little bit too. Oh, you'd like to make it lighter and better and et cetera? Let's go work on that. Right. And so what would it have allowed him to do? Call his suppliers and actually get those necessary innovations, those things that were on the roadmap that reasonably never met the pricing that would have been required to make sense in automotive, to then drive the innovation, because he had heard all the pitches of all the cool stuff of, if you give me this much money, this is what I can go do, and think about how much better it would be. And then he'd look at the consumer and would say, there's no way I can get someone to pay that much for a car. Yeah, we're not going to do that. And so going back to your point of the bombers by the end of World War II look an awful lot like, not that dissimilar to a B-52 and kind of what is possible to build today. If you want something that, is kind of a pure bomber. But in my opinion, it was his ability to speak the language of business and simultaneously fit in the uniform culture of at the time the Army that made that one extra special. With Kaiser, there's kind of the part, and look at like the legacy of like Kaiser Permanente. In many ways, the big innovation that Kaiser bought when he did the Hoover Dam was he put healthcare on site for his employees. Because if you're building the Hoover Dam, you're kind of out in the middle of nowhere, right? Especially in the interwar period. And so how do you keep people there and working? You ensure that they don't have to leave and travel for a day to go see a doctor because they have an issue. You bring the healthcare to them. And so big innovation one that really helped with Hoover Dam, I think, is that part of the story. And then big innovation two, associated with the Liberty ships, is the ability to build the Liberty ships was purely paid for by government capital, but the actual profit of running the operations went to Kaiser. And so look at the industrial base that we have today. When you look at all of the major primes, the U.S. government fundamentally is the one that is paying for the capex, but who is it that operationally is actually making the profit? It is the publicly traded companies. And so, and then from there we can go and we can touch on the difference between the Navy culture that actually kind of did maintain a armament capability inside of the Naval Research Lab, and kind of what today you would call the SysComs, the Naval Surface Warfare Center, the the undersea kind of side, but the Warfare Center side of the Navy, versus the very different culture you have at the Air Force, where the Air Force fundamentally was birthed with this incredible dependency and utilization of the commercial industrial base. Walking the hallways at Air Force Research Lab versus Naval Research Lab, they are you can't pick somebody up who is good at one, move them to the other, and expect them on day one to be good. There are massive cultural differences that show up there, as well as in the SysCom side between the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy. But anyway, I'm going to pause on that. We can get to that topic here in a few minutes as well.
Well, that's the really fun part about having you on here to talk, is you've seen this stuff. You've seen it inside, right? I haven't. So, and so I learned from you. I learned from you about what the culture is like, what's going on, from having conversations like this. 20 times the number of American workers were killed or injured in 1942-43 working in American factories and doing this armaments buildup than were killed or injured in the field service in the Army, in the armed forces. So, I mean, this was a big deal. A lot of people did get hurt. And so having some of that healthcare experience there, I'm sure really, really helped. Okay. So do we really need Bill Knudsen? Is it him or nobody? Or if he didn't exist, was there somebody else, do you think, who would have stepped up to the plate, who had a similar background with the network? Or was it just Bill being himself?
Yep. So there's the famous attributed to Churchill quote of the United States does the right thing after it's exhausted every other possibility. Break. My glasses are in the last place I thought to look for them, because after I find them, it was the last place I thought to look. And after I find them, why would I keep looking? Right. And so to go back to the Churchill one, right. Once we have figured out the right thing, why would we try something else? That would be kind of silly. Right. And so we've exhausted every other possibility, but if that one didn't work, we would have done something else. And I believe we would have tried something else. With that in mind, I am not a subscriber to kind of the overall great man theory of history, where like it had to be only this one person. I think that there are much bigger trends in terms of kind of our zeitgeist and using like the Kuhnian definition of the word paradigm. Right, like you can't separate what is happening politically versus what's happening with commerce versus how I approach shopping online versus how I approach social media, right? Like I can't bifurcate and be like, I'm only going to get my news this way by reading a newspaper that gets delivered twice a day, right? But I'm going to do my shopping online. Like you can't fully separate these things out in any sort of a way. So with that in mind, if not Knudsen, I think it would have looked something like someone like him. Or we would have ended up taking, a different, totally different hypothesis, which is the government is capable of saying this is the platform and this is the thing that I need. Would the producibility have been as good? Probably not. Would the affordability have been as good? Probably not. Would the United States have exited World War II with with kind of the overall, GDP and production capability that we had? Probably not. Right? Would it have made the Cold War look a lot different and reasonably harder? Probably yes. But would we have found a way to to produce things in the volumes that were required to go through and kind of make the war effort happen? I think that answer is yes. But it would have been a very different path through the next 2 decades. And so, for the path that we took at the beginning of World War II, it reasonably set up, kind of the overall GDP advantage that we had through the Cold War and the ability to invest the necessary resources into innovation as well as defense that ultimately the Soviet Union couldn't keep up with. Right when you look at many of those lessons, and I think last time we talked about the lesson from the Cold War of we are going to out innovate. If you look at the size of the Chinese GDP for anybody looking in the China direction and saying we're just going to we're going to outspend, we're going to out innovate, their GDP is just as big, if not bigger than ours when you do it as a purchase power parity comparison, which means that lesson from the Cold War is not applicable today.
Okay. Very, very interesting. Yeah, the great man theory of history is something that's, as a kid, it's easy to believe. As an adult, there's more nuances. I mean, I think of Genghis Khan, he's one where, I got to go back to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History and re-listen to like, how did those Mongolians end up, in charge of all of Asia? That's possibly one situation, but like Hitler, no, I think there would have been a World War II. I think there was enough embarrassment, nationalism, pride, anger in Germany to rearm, and some politician would have done it. Would it have included the Holocaust, wars of extermination? No, probably not. But definitely a war for energy, a war for continental dominance was coming over there. Okay, so somebody would have come along. There would have been an impact, probably lessening production, output, GDP, all that stuff. Do we have any barriers to adopting a manufacturers-led approach like this today? Because anybody listening to the conversation I did with Mike Brown right before this knows after Bob McNamara, we went to this command control, systems thinking, economy with big purchases and long lead times.
So can we do it? Yes. And then I think the question is, what is the level of pride that different people have, and where are the areas that people are willing to delegate a little bit of that to allow someone else to really do the innovative thinking that ultimately makes something behave differently. In many ways, I think that we are still we are suffering our way through kind of an industrial age thinking, which is on the assembly line. If so and so retires, gets sick, we promote them, we put them in a different job. Well, I'm just going to reach in my hopper of people and I'm going to move this person over and I'm going to put them down here. Right? If I for anyone that is at a publicly traded company, how much time do we spend in Excel or looking at other fundamentally spreadsheet / database driven ways of trying to get to the insight and making a decision? It's pretty darn massive. Right. And at the same time, who is it that's actually going to go and, that one little line on that one little spreadsheet that ends up becoming something that is massively important for the nation, for the, for the company, for whatever, is the part that there's no real way to parse out and tease out for how some of those things are going to occur. So wrapped up in that, is probably a request to many people that are in uniform, which is there are things that are happening with the technology that underpin the systems that you are going to have, right? If you ask me to go design my phone, I am not going to do a very good job of doing it, but I am thrilled that there is an entire, ecosystem and, innovative way of looking at that then brings me what it is that I need. And I'm going to wager the designers of, in my case, I have an iPhone there that I just held up, right? The original iPhone, if you would have told people this is what everyone's going to be using it for in 20 years, they would have said, there's no, that doesn't even make sense, right? And maybe there would have been one or two people that said, yeah, I can see that, but I also think they do this, or this. If you want to have fun, go back and read Joe Matola's original cognitive radio paper from, I think, 1999. Right? And the microphone would have always been listening kind of a thing. And it would have been like, oh, nice to meet you. And then your phone would have prompted saying, would you like to trade phone numbers with? Right? Do any of us want a microphone that is always on? But if we, right, and if I was to say, anything involving SIRI, right, like my phone would come to life. And so there at some level, right, there are the things there that are always listening, but we give them a prompt as opposed to letting them actually record all the time. So maybe there's a handful of people that would have been visionary enough that would have said, this is everything that it could go do. So to those in uniform, there probably is there are things that are bubbling up, and there are other ways of solving the problem other than how we do it today that you have to be open-minded to, and therefore not try to perfectly prescribe. The second one, which I think is actually the legacy of kind of the McNamara era through the 60s, is we have made it incredibly hard inside of government to actually change the strategy, to shift, to pivot, and to do something that is new, that we have not spent years messaging is what we're going to go do next. And so, broadly, the PBB, the planning, budgeting, execution, like this is I think it's deeper in some ways than just PPBE. I think that it is the blend between a bureaucracy with, I am here to be the decision maker, which means decisions end up flowing up that could have been made at a lower level. And so there's that part. And then when we do try to form a more integrated team where you get the expertise of this is what the user wants, this is what we can afford from a financial side, this is what is technically possible, with more the tech development side, this is what from a policy standpoint we consider acceptable to go forth and actually build into our strategy, right? I mean, one academically could have the conversation that we could achieve with only nuclear weapons everything that we need, and we don't actually need a conventional stockpile of any way, shape, or form. Alternatively, you can make the argument that we can do everything conventionally with no nuclear capability. Going to either extreme, but from a policy standpoint, we probably want a policy debate before we make that decision, right? And so what is from a policy standpoint acceptable? And so we form what should be an integrated team, and we then very bureaucratically flow that insight up and ask for our boss's boss's boss, our boss's 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 boss to make a decision. We then, president's budget gets delivered once a year over to Capitol Hill. And you then go and you attempt to explain to, either members of Congress or their staff, this is why this is the right set of priorities. And you're talking to people, throughout that entire process that are really smart that go, hey, a year ago, you told me that this was the thing that mattered. Are you changing your strategy? Right. And I can point back to my time at DARPA where I was sitting there with my boss, and I went through what I thought was this New Start program. This was going to be really cool and impactful. And he looked across the conference table and he said, was that a different New Start? Because I thought we were here to talk about the idea that, that I had shared with you, a couple of weeks back. And I realized at that moment that I had a choice. I could take off my badge and put it on the table and say, this is the idea that I want to carry forward, and this is the thing that we have to go do. or I could say, tell me again about the idea that you were thinking about. Right. And I stayed at DARPA for a couple of years. Obviously, I picked path number two, right, as a young PM trying to figure out the organization and what right looked like. But fundamentally, there are some crossroads that you end up at there. The other part that I would offer, in addition to, broadly, how do we do things faster, is how do we allow people to use things in ways that we never intended when we did the design? And so, as you hit on, the bombers of World War II were all designed prior to the war, but the theory of strategic bombing that LeMay and others had been working on prior to the start of the war, versus what happened through World War II, versus what we expected after the war, we've come a long way. And so fundamentally, what does that mean? It is that, hey, as a user, what you gave me was this, but how I really want to go use it is in this other way. And so how do we make a GUI on the back end of a system such that a user deployed forward can say, this system isn't doing what I need. I needed to do this. Right? In the case of my phone I just held up, I have a volume up and a volume down button. Every now and again, there is so much background noise that I throw in a pair of noise canceling headphones. And I use the device that way because it's what allows me to accomplish my mission. How many defense systems have we tried to say it will only operate this way? We have narrowed the function. This is what it does. If you touch anything, if you try to write a code, if you those are things that we don't expect an operator deployed forward to do. And I'm not saying that every operator we want writing code in the back end of their radar and it's going to, be an FPGA programming expert writing firmware. But I bet you we have a couple of them in uniform that are going to be sitting on an island somewhere in the Pacific, sitting somewhere in, some odd corner of the globe where they can't get the reach back. And they're going to say, I think I could do this differently or better. Right. And so all of us have that friend. That is the person that we go to when we have that really weird, problem. We go, how do you solve this one? And so how do we let that person, if they happen to be sitting there, to say, yeah, let me open up a laptop. Let me try typing a couple lines of code. Let me see if I can make it work better. How do we let that innovative thinking go in, as opposed to, from the five-sided wind tunnel of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., you shall fight the fight this way, right? Because we're not getting access into the brain power, the cranium of that operator that is actually the one closest to it. And not everyone's going to do it, but that 1%, that couple of percent, let's let them do exactly that.
Right. Wow. That it brought up like so many pictures in my head. I know radar systems were being retrofitted onto battleships earlier in World War II, and some officers were refusing to use them because they didn't understand them. I was like, I don't know how to use this. So, like this happens, people, right? It's all this money and all this energy was spent installing that system onto that ship, and then no, I don't want to. And then also, I've been in multinationals, hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, and you're in kind of the control room where they're usually run by spreadsheets, which is hilarious to me. But these giant like Excel type of spreadsheets. But I've been in situations where new CRM databases and tracking customers and orders and that have been deployed, and there are a few people who run in there right away and go into every menu and see, what can this thing do, right? Where are the limits of this thing? And I'm not like that, right? I'm much more of a sit back and wait, and let somebody come to me kind of thing about it, which is curious. But I've seen this behavior, right, of that 1% who will run in there and go, yeah, let me tap the keys and see what happens.
But at the same time, if the first day the first electric car came out, if everyone said, I want to go buy it, we would have had how much excess capacity to build, right, as a nation, traditional internal combustion vehicles, and how much of, between electrical grid infrastructure and battery, production and that was not able to run at that scale. And so we, as a nation, we benefit from a phased adoption. And so I think that, I don't think that's a bad thing, right? Because you don't want everyone to, on day one, go, I'm going to do it. I will do it uniformly because it is here, right? Like, that's not helpful. And so how does everyone approach the technology, integrate it into, how they are thinking about tactically executing their fight that day? Ultimately, how does that aggregate into the operational plan? but in many ways that diversity then means that on whatever given day that you see a U.S. warship or aircraft or just because you saw the same tail number the day before or the same ship the day before does not mean it's going to be behaving the same way. It may have a different set of capabilities or a different mission impact because the capabilities that are resident on it are getting used differently.
Right. It's their stretching.
And,
Yeah. World War II, pre-World War II, interwar period, how are we going to use planes, bombers on aircraft carriers?
Yeah.
Nobody knew how to do it. They had to run exercises and war game it out and give it a shot and see what happens. So, and you might have a traditional commander who's more like me, who's like, all right, let's use it the way that they tell us. And then over time, or I see, somebody else there did a better job with it. And then there are other guys who rose to be admiral who were like, no, go attack, find the enemy and destroy them, right? So centralized design and purchasing is really slowing down our innovation today. Then I think that's a takeaway that we could experience, but also the pride of this is my little area of the world and I'm in charge of it and I need to be in charge of it, right? And you got to come see me about this little cubicle of decision making, right? Have you seen anything in your experience that allows people to relax about that stuff other than, I guess, just doing what we're doing right now, getting to know somebody a little bit better, right?
So the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense that hired me into the Pentagon was a guy by the name of Jimmy McStravick, and Jimmy tragically passed away a couple of years ago from cancer. There are probably 100 different kind of Jimmy quotes that a bunch of us I think have stuck with in some way, shape, or form. But the one that is relevant to the question you just posed is we move at the speed of trust. And so, very, very deliberately, right? If the first time that I really need something is the first time that I expose my wife to the thinking about that thing, I'm probably going to get a no answer. If the first time that I call the contracting officer and say I need help with is the time that I am asking them to do something that is a little bit out of what we typically do or ordinarily do, or hold on, why is it? Explain to me why we're doing that again. Right. But if you're moving through a shared lens of respect, trust, and existing relationship, it's amazing when you pick up the phone and you call someone and you say, I need this done like yesterday. So can we please do it this afternoon? It gets done. Right. And so there's I think the ability to leverage, and just that quote, we move at the speed of trust. Because the reality is, right, if I look at my time in government, what my contracting officers were worried about versus what I was worried about, interested in, we were not thinking about the same things as being important. Break, they helped me cover where I had some really big blind spots. And if I look at, my now day job at Mercury, as we are trying to do, the most advanced, cutting edge, state of the art, and I was on a call last night at 6 p.m. where we're putting out a ROM for, this is the most advanced thing that you could possibly think to do in packaging microelectronics as we try to reshore that from like 2% back up to a rational number that actually can support our national interest and, national defense. As we're doing that, and I'm like, but look at this and think about the mission impact that we could build. And our contracting officer, right, our head of contracting is on the call. And he asked a question. I'm just like, yeah, that one's probably pretty important to ask too, right? And so you need all of those different views, right? Because I've been in enough different meetings with them because we know each other, because we respect each other. I'm not going to sit there and be like, Dave, that's not the thing we need to talk about, right? But let's make sure we spend a few minutes on that. Break. If the only thing we talk about are the contractual concerns and we never talk about the technical differentiators, we haven't done justice to the topic either. Right. And so how do we bring all of those views together? But my one word of wisdom is if the first time you're calling someone is when you're asking them to step on the gas pedal, it will probably not go well. And the secondary part that I would offer is for anyone that can be a gate, and amusingly, this is actually another Jimmyism. Jimmy advised us all to be a thug, never to be a troll.
Huh.
And you look at that and you go, huh? So trolls live underneath bridges,
Yep.
right? Your proposal can't go out the door. You can't award your contract. You can't, start production until. And so as a troll, to go over my bridge in this, medieval story and, whatever, you shall pay me, the troll, to cross my bridge. Don't be a troll, be a thug. What happens in a fantasy book when the thug shows up in chapter 2? It shows up when the main characters are early in their adventure, and the thug says, "You're going with me, and I'm going with you for the entirety of this story. And when we slay the dragon, and you get all the treasure that is your quest, you're paying me too." And so the thug only gets paid at the end when the main characters actually complete their quest. And so the secondary one that I would offer as a bit of advice is be a thug, don't be a troll. Right. And so for anyone that can gate, go on the journey. Be successful when the entire team actually accomplishes the mission. And in operational parlance, right, we would be like, oh, well, we have done a value stream map and we have identified that it takes this long to do. And it's like, does it make sense to do that? Right. And when you look at it, right, every step, it's like, I get it. That was important. That was critical. But when you step back and you look at it holistically and you go, are we really like going to design an integrated computer that's 25 years old and try to get an operator like an 18-year-old, 19-year-old kid that went down and, joined it? Like, this is the thing of the future.
Right.
He's older than I am, right? Like that should be their response. And they should throw us back out and be like, value stream map your stuff and bring me something that works, that doesn't stink. Right. And so most of the time we tend to view things as the importance of each step. And too often it's comfortable to be a troll. And so, yeah, my objective is to be a thug. In that's probably a really weird thing to say out of context.
No,
My
it makes a lot of sense.
but it makes sense in the context of the story. Yeah.
There's a lot of selling and sales involved in here, from that time where you were sitting down with your boss trying to present the plan and he said, well, wait a minute, what about my idea? Do you want to push for your own and have to make that big sale, especially as a junior project manager, or do you want to involve his energy and his idea, right? And move along with that? And what's the right approach?
And better yet, he might know something I don't know, right? And if I make use of both ears, I might learn something through that discussion.
Right.
For why something was at that moment in time the right thing to go ahead and do. And so it's too often I think we get excited about, this is my thing and you have to do it this way. And if we use our ears, we might do better.
All right. Entropy should be stable unless somebody's messing with the boundary conditions.
Cheer up, Jason. I've initiated a controlled entropy acceleration zone right under your garage.
Pebble, what does that mean?
You're participating in the first at-home simulation of a miniature black hole's thermodynamic profile. Very chic.
You made a fake black hole in the garage?
Technically, it's a synthetic singularity shadow with entropic bleed. You'll love it. Your time perception should already be stretching.
Pebble, shut it down. Why are all the clocks running backwards? And why does my burrito taste like algebra?
Okay, fine. But entropy is just misunderstood. Like jazz or neutrinos.
My burrito's in a waveform function now. Hope you're happy.
You mentioned in here, and we've talked about it a little bit, pairing the user and the developer. I want to talk about this idea of shared vernacular and why that's so important, because even the engineers and the purchasers are off in their own little worlds, and they've got, as you pointed out, different priorities, right? About what's going to help or hurt them and their careers and their day-to-day emotions in going through the roles of their jobs, right? How does this shared vernacular come about? Why is it important, and how can we like consciously develop it?
There is a lot to unpack. I'm like, let me stare into the distance and where to begin on that. So too often, I think kind of in our area of technical expertise and kind of the tribe that we belong to, right? And so if you ask me, like, what union card do you carry, right? Like, I'm a degreed engineer. That's how I am going to approach almost any problem. Someone with an MBA is going to approach it through a different lens. There's a different, this could be an entire next one for us to sit down and talk about. Robert Keegan wrote a book entitled "In Over Our Heads," which is a very interesting, insightful, and fun read. There's some good videos out there that do kind of a short description of it that are much easier to digest than reading the entire book. Having done both, I would advise the video. The book is it's a little verbose. But what's interesting is you can get a group of 20 something people to have one set of actual shared values and behave kind of completely together as a cohesive whole. And so think about kind of a tribal structure. You're talking groups of measured in tens to hundreds. It becomes interesting when you go up to the next level of society, right? With 300 million people scattered across the United States. Could we actually operate under one cohesive, kind of tribal set of ideas and values? I would argue our two-party political system is actually what helps us have stability, because it allows people to identify with a tribe, get down to a smaller level of people. But at the same time, if one goes in a direction that doesn't make sense, then the other ends up with kind of a motion of people into that group. And it allows us to evolve at a rate that overall everybody finds acceptable. Is it the quickest way to get anything done? Probably not, right? But does it work, and is it stable? I would argue yes. At a few billion people on the surface of the globe, could we get there with only one view of this is the right way to run a society and a government? And so by having multiple competing systems, it then allows the different systems to say, well, this is successful in this way, this is successful in that way. But for us holistically to actually move at a rate that makes sense as a few billion people on the surface of Earth. So with that in mind, I don't think that everyone has to speak from a individual shared vernacular. But I think the trick is when someone says something and you go, I have no idea what that means. You have to be willing to raise your hand and admit, I actually don't know what that means, right? And so I grew up in the world of like RF and microwave, kind of electronics, electronic warfare. Like that's the world that I come from. EVM is error vector magnitude. It's a thing that I measure on a real-time spectrum analyzer that tells me if data is going to be decoded right as a 1 or a 0. When I hear EVM and I go to my roots, that is the first thing that comes to mind. I then went and I got indoctrinated in the program management side because that's kind of where professionally the career was taking me. And it turns out if I say EVM to anyone that is in that tribe, they immediately go earn value management. And so then the trick is I have to know my audience. Which definition are they likely to use? And if I'm in a room where both could be used, I have to make sure I actually say both. How many times, right? And I can point to one thing I was reading back in the Pentagon. It was a kind of spectrum operations. How are we going to behave in the future? And it was talking about early warning radar. It was talking about electronic warfare systems that were going to jam. On I think it was page 2, early warning EW radars was defined with EW having every time we use the term EW, it means a early warning radar. So the EW is going to be used to surveil the battle space. 2 paragraphs later, EW, electronic warfare systems, are going to be used to jam radars. And nobody actually stepped back and read the thing and went, did we just define EW twice in the same page with 2 different meanings? And so it was obvious it had been written by 2 authors. They had come from 2 different communities, and both of them were like, oh yeah, EW means this, right? And so how many times do we end up with the alphabet soup, the acronyms, the whatever? And by context, you can very, very quickly figure out what's going on as long as you speak enough of that language. And so how do you allow someone to soak in another community to broadly understand what the language is and understand not only, what the language is, but why someone is worried about that, to make sure that holistically we're kind of, covering down on the different issues that could pop up. And so, broadly, I think I just, argued this is why you need an integrated team. But you also need people that can go back and articulate, hey, these were the values. This is the reason that this was the decision that came back down. Let me put it in context that inside of that group of, 20 in the tribe, everyone goes, oh, I understand the logic, right? And so what am I doing in my day job right now is we're shaping our IRAD plan and we're figuring out what to do with, a substantial level of investment to build the innovative next round of things that are needed. If I start talking beeps and squeaks to finance, their eyes glaze over and they're like, I don't know why I needed to know that. I don't know why I care. But if I can say this is half the size, it's twice the capability, this is going to be the thing that is actually going to fuel sales in 2 years and therefore revenue, they go, oh, I get it. Right? Break. If I go and I talk to engineers and I go, and the business model innovation that you brought to bear on this and the margin profile, they're like, the technology is kind of cool too, right? And so how do you, but fundamentally, how do you explain in the values of what made the decision happen, and then give the part that everyone really needs to understand? So I in my day job, I spend a lot of time doing that. That hopefully then allows us to go faster. But again, it's that moving at the speed of trust.
Okay, interesting. I've seen that analogy before, about the tribes and talking to different tribes and the difference between the chieftain or the chief and the witch doctor. And I'm the witch doctor. Like, that's my archetype, right? I can travel. I can go and be respected in group and then come back to mine, right? The chiefs will be respected too, but they might get killed.
Yes.
It's sort of interesting to see which one am I. All right. Well, let's finish up with something you've listed here, which I didn't know about, so it's going to be very educational. We've got a couple of organizations, instruments that have been put in place to help us solve these innovation issues, maybe, like they're at least there. One of them is the CHIPS Act, which is about semiconductors, which the Biden administration put in 2022. And the other one is AUKUS, or AUKUS. It's a trilateral Indo-Pacific security arrangement between Australia, the UK, and America since 2021. So tell us a little bit about those, give us the Coles notes, and then how they can be used to drive innovation in defense manufacturing.
So if we back up, and so I'm gonna hopefully only reference one other book for everyone to consider picking up. So Norm Augustine was at Lockheed at the helm as Lockheed became Lockheed Martin. He was there for the iconic, Last Supper that kind of drove the consolidation of the defense industrial base through the 90s. And he wrote a book appropriately entitled Augustine's Laws. And so it was his quip at what it was that was going on. The one that many people have heard of is, and I want to say it's by like the year 2050. He gives this specific year. An aircraft will be so expensive that the entire, Department of Defense budget can buy one airplane. The Air Force will operate at half the year. The Navy will operate at half the year. And once every 4 years, on February 29th, the Marine Corps will be allowed to fly the airplane. And so, right, and you look at it, but, fundamentally look at, go back to World War II through today, the cost of an airplane, the numbers have gone up. He is not inaccurate in that. One of his other laws that is a little less appreciated is he claims, and I want to say it was by the year, and it's like 2015-ish, that there will be no airplane crashes anymore. And you go, great, that sounds pretty good, right? I mean, he'd written that down, 2 decades prior or whatever. And you go, I love the sound of there being no airplane crashes. And he says that there will be no airplane crashes because there will be no airplane takeoffs. And there will be no airplane takeoffs because the weight of the electronics to operate the airplane will be so heavy that the plane will no longer be able to get airborne. And so his is a little bit more pithy as opposed to the way that I just told it. But what's interesting is when you look underneath the hood at what makes a modern military system actually function, it isn't the outer mold line, right? Your comment, pushing an hour ago now as we started the recording, was right by a B-29 at the end of World War II does not look that dissimilar to the type of aircraft that we might build today. We understood the aerodynamics. We had kind of figured that side out. We had figured out the materials, and therefore, roughly, this is the right size of airplane to go off and build. And runways are about the same size as they were then. It's about the, kind of the overall right way to do everything. But look at the electronics that got us to the moon. Look at the electronics that were on board a B-29 versus look at what is inside of an F-35, an F-22, an F-A-18, a B-21, or whatever, pick your favorite platform today. The electronics are massively different. And in my opinion, the part that Augustine did not get right when he said that there would be no airplane crashes because there would be no takeoff because of the weight of the electronics, he had not really thought through the Moore's Law side. of
yeah,
that in
that's
terms
exactly what
of, doubling of transistors, and what does that mean for the compute power, and therefore what's going to happen to weight. The power required to cool inside, that's another can of worms. We can go back and deep dive on just that, because it's an area of innovation near and dear to my heart, from my past life in government, but obviously also now in my day job here at Mercury. So there's a part there. But what's interesting about microelectronics, and another good, you can find it on YouTube thing to go watch for everyone that hasn't, is Steve Blank, The Secret History of Silicon Valley.
Yes.
Right. Silicon Valley.
Once a week, I share. I have
Yep.
all the slides
Yep.
for his presentation on Google Drive. I will link to them in the
Awesome.
description.
It
Okay.
is
Yes.
right, but it is a phenomenal look at like how did the valley become what it is today. In many ways,
Microwave
it's actually
Valley.
is
Yeah.
right is tied to what was needed for EW systems, back in World War II. And so with that in mind, innovative thinking, go fast, EW, blah blah blah. So we as a nation helped get semiconductors to work in a big way, right? And so kind of through the heyday of the 60s to like the beginning of personal computing in the 80s, to the cellular side where we are today, the underlying intellectual property that makes a device work, that allows us to have this conversation, separated by hundreds of miles, is stuff that is in many ways core to a whole bunch of US flagged businesses. Cool.
Yep.
We own the intellectual property. What can you make? I own the intellectual property, right? Like that doesn't really get you there. And so Chris Miller wrote the book Chip War. It came out 2, maybe 3 years ago. That kind of lays out how the global semiconductor ecosystem evolved, the why behind it, in a lot of different ways. So while the U.S. owns the majority of kind of the IP that goes into a semiconductor and the design, like overall IP of this is the design and what is needed, roughly 20% is fabbed either in North America slash Europe. And it's basically 80% that is coming out of Asia. But when you look at what is packaged, and so, hey, I build a wafer, right? And like everybody loves to like show up, and they put up the wafer, and like it's reflective and it looks really cool. It turns out that a wafer by itself is not very useful. When I was out at our facility in Phoenix, they gave me a piece of bare die that I then could like haul around and show people. I broke it carrying it around in my bag because it turns out that bare die wafers are as brittle as a piece of glass, and I'm pretty good at breaking glass as well, right? But if you do that, you will end up breaking it at some point. So you have to package it. The United States is engaged in packaging a couple percent of the microelectronics that are used, and the vast majority of that is in greater than 80% is happening in Asia. And so if you think about what is there that is required to actually, operate in wartime, going back to Knudsen, energize your supply chain. If the war is over Taiwan, and that's where the things are fabbed, and it's where you therefore end up with packaging in close proximity to, it's going to be really hard to say I want advanced microelectronics inside of the system. And so what is the $52 billion worth of the CHIPS Act? It is focused around how do we, inside of the US, bring more of that back. Okay. There have been similar initiatives in a variety of other countries that are kind of looking at this overall pivot of where globally do we want semiconductor production. And so I've heard the 52 billion not get described as like this is a once in a generation. No, it's not. Like we cannot do this every couple of decades. Candidly, it's not a once in a lifetime. We can't do it once a century. This is a once. And so with the 52 billion, how do we actually, and there are people that love the word ecosystem, there are people that hate it. I like to use it with a belief that I have some level of understanding for what it is I'm trying to accomplish with it. We are trying to build a onshore ecosystem that can sustain itself and innovate and produce the necessary microelectronics. And when I say produce, not just fab, but actually have the materials going into the fab. And once we actually have the bare die that is really hard to, you can't use in a system to get it packaged into something that actually will work. And so, there's a long journey associated with that. The tension that always shows up is, do you want to do, chips that are going into automotive manufacturing through COVID? We all saw the impact, back in 2020, 21 around automotive. Is, in my opinion, they got out of line for like the bathroom at the Super Bowl, and then they went back and they said, "I'd like my spot back in line," and everybody looked at them and said, right? Like, I've been standing here waiting too. And the overall disruption that we felt there was pretty massive. So associated with the CHIPS Act, and then kind of building from there into AUKUS. AUKUS and broadly what is happening strategically there, I think, is the biggest change in kind of the export regulations, from the commerce side associated with the EAR, from the State Department associated with ITAR, but broadly acknowledging that geopolitical strategy, right? And so I'm on the phone pretty regularly with the Mercury team that is in the UK. And as I am chatting with them, yeah, we can go back to 1776. It becomes a little bit interesting as we're recording on July 3rd, right? Where it's like, and there's a call with someone who is, UK born on July 5th. It turns out they think 7 a.m. is a suitable time on July 5th to make a phone call, because July 4th doesn't quite have the same meaning for them. But the level of mutual trust and respect that we have had for, somewhere between 1 and 2 centuries is massive and is there. Similarly with the Australians, there's a level of mutual understanding, mutual respect. If we are going to, be sharing, how we think about nuclear submarines, we can probably choose to share how we think about microelectronics. We can choose to think about, what is there that actually makes a platform survivable, a mission capable, allows a radar to work, full up. How do we share those insights? How do we get the best of the best holistically across, all three working? And so, kind of broadly there is this is not a US conversation. But in the case of AUKUS, pointing to two of our closest allies there. But we are fortunate when you look, holistically at kind of the global group of allies partners that the US has. How do we think holistically to solve those problems that ultimately, going back to Keegan, at the global level, actually, provide the necessary level of stability. So taking us all the way back up to a global picture there. But the 52 billion going in is huge. There have been some really good photo ops of, here we are, all holding the shovels doing the groundbreaking. And the thing that I will advocate for is it is an ecosystem, and you need the supply chain that feeds the fab, and we have to get the packaging side right so we can actually get something on a board so we can go do. And too often we fall back in that trap of the great man theory where, you go, well, why did Hitler say that? Believing that you understand the war, but there was a lot more that was happening around, surrounding him and around him, that ultimately allowed it to go the way that it did. And so similarly, if all we choose to focus on are the billions of dollars going to the big fabs, we aren't actually holistically solving the problem we need to solve.
Okay. Very, very interesting. And it's doubly interesting to see, we've got that fellow talking about the, forget his name right now, the destruction of global supply chains. And that's the reason why we need to retreat to the United States for production. But here it's a national security issue, and a good one, right? I told Mike Brown, I thought Elon Musk should use his boring machine to make an underground facility, and we make our chips there, and you can't bomb it. Right? It's underground, but these things are tremendously expensive to make. Any semiconductor facility are stupid expensive.
Yep.
So,
and then there's also all of the intellectual property associated with actually producing.
Right.
And so while the U.S. owns kind of the design side of IP, in many cases, right, TSMC, Taiwan, there's a handful of companies that have invested a ton of capital and a ton of IRAD and a ton of intellectual property associated with how to produce. Right, UV lithography is one as a Google term, just to give everyone the ability to go and look at. You will not build a modern advanced semiconductor if you don't have Europe in your supply chain, because of the need for UV lithography today.
And I think there's Italian and French firms that do this really well.
It's I want to say Netherlands.
Okay.
And I out of fear that I get the name wrong and that it's out there in the recording
say
more, I'm just going to say I'm 99% sure it's Netherlands. And right, it's obviously it's not part of in my day job one of the things that we require, but I know that it's one of the things that the fabs do. And if the fabs aren't producing chips, then we're not packaging them. And so but again, those individual points of who has spent the time, the energy, and really understands how to do it, and how do we keep everybody rowing as a team to ensure that we accomplish the right outcome.
Okay. I'm really very interested in seeing who that guy was. I'll probably put the name up.
Yeah. Yep.
It's somebody we all know. I could see him. He has a beard too, just like us.
Yeah. In that case, we have to like the guy.
Yeah. He's part of the club. So,
yep.
Well, Bill, thanks for doing this. I always appreciate having you on. It'll be curious where this goes, and I don't know why, but my intuition guides me a lot in topics and who to talk to and that. And the fact that procurement in the DoD has become really top level interest, right, lately, to me anyway, right, is not an accident, right?
Yeah.
And it was a happy coincidence that you wanted to talk about Freedom's Forge and what's happening with electronics manufacturing here in the States. But I look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah. Yep. Cool. Sounds good. Awesome. Yeah, and I get to jump back into some of those Excel spreadsheets that you mentioned. So good deal. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, Bill.
Yep. Bye.
Thanks for hanging out with us on the Cold Start Project. Hey, listen, if you're a founder or a leader at a space or defense company and you're serious about building a commercial revenue stream, or your operations need a full overhaul, it's time we talked. At Cold Start Tech, we don't just hand you a report or an assessment and walk away. I get a lot of presidents who tell me they've experienced that. We get in there with you. Real help, real change. You don't have to lead alone. Let's build something that lasts. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm Jason Canigan, or go to coldstartech.com and pick a time to speak from there. Thanks for listening.